Hello, everybody. For my activism project this semester, I decided to create a policy brief. When we think of violence against others, most of us automatically view it as a crime that is punishable by law. Unfortunately, violence does still exist and is widespread enough to remain a significant issue in our society. It was only about 50 years ago that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and primarily violence against women were deemed acceptable, expected, and even deserved. The social problem that I addressed was violence against others in the forms of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and the emotional, mental, and physical abuse that is usually present simultaneously. According to the United Nations General Assembly, the 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women presented the definition of domestic violence as any act of gender based violence that results in, or is likely to result in, physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. And this definition also encompassed emotional, physical, mental, and sexual violence, whether it was perpetrated by family, community, or state tolerated. Prior to the 1960s, women were mostly homemakers, and after that, the women's liberation movement allowed for women to fight for equality and to progress outside of their roles as just housewives and mothers. In 1979, Ellie Walker wrote a novel entitled The Battered Woman, and that became the first book to define violence against women as a social problem. As a result, battered woman syndrome became known as the description of the various forms of damage done to women as a result of being victimized by violence. Congress passed the 1984 Family Violence Prevention Services Act, which allocated federal funding to the prevention of domestic violence. And then 10 years later, the Violence Against Women Act became a law which addressed sexual, domestic, and dating violence, as well as deemed intimate partner violence a criminal act. And then in 2013, there was also the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which included provisions for undocumented immigrants. So, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence actually lists several statistics which show the large impact that this social problem has on society. There are over 10 million people who are victims of their intimate partners per year in the United States. 1 in 3 women have been victimized, with 1 in 4 being victimized severely, and 1 in 4 men have been victimized, with 1 in 7 being victimized severely. This type of violence actually makes up 15% of crime in the United States, and women ages 18 to 24 represent the highest at risk group. The activist activity that I selected was creating a policy brief in support of Bill H.R. 1963, which is the Fair Housing for Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Survivors Act of 2017. This was introduced by Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz in April of 2017, so about a year ago. I chose to support this bill because it addresses survivors of intimate partner violence and related violence by highlighting the link between them and homelessness and proposing that they are eligible for housing via explicit protections under the Fair Housing Act. According to some statistics cited in H.R. 1963, nearly 50% of women who are homeless state that being victims of intimate partner violence and related violence has impacted and significantly contributed to their homeless statuses. This is a picture of my policy brief that I sent in to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a New York State Senator. It might be a little bit hard for you guys to see, but I basically spoke a little bit about what H.R. 1963 is. I defined intimate partner violence. I listed some of those statistics that I just spoke about, some proposals, and some ways that the bill can be improved. And then this was the letter that I sent along with the bill, basically, once again, listing similar things and asking Senator Gillibrand to please acknowledge this bill and to, if she has any kind of influence, to try and push it along. And really, I just wanted to reach out to somebody with power and influence. So the reason that I support H.R. 1963 is that if victims are able to obtain housing and safely leave their abusers with limited repercussions, then this will become a form of abuse prevention, as it will thwart the control and fear imposed upon victims. Therefore, I felt that supporting this bill would be a helpful form of advocacy. And beyond creating this policy brief, I did send a letter to New York State Senator Kirsten Gillibrand in the hope that I would receive a response. So, why is this activism? Activism is a form of action that is empowering to those advocating, and by directly addressing those who are advantaged, the likelihood of their desire, ability, and complacency to discriminate is diminished, as it overtly goes against their values, which are now explicitly catered to. I feel that my policy brief and letter in support of this bill are advocacy because I did feel empowered and I was able to attempt to connect with someone advantaged and influential to try and make a difference. Some gaps that need to be addressed in the social problem of violence against women. This activity addresses a gap in our treatment of the social problem of violence against women because it specifically targets a bill which promotes help for both citizens and undocumented immigrants who fall victim to violence. Given that this bill discusses homelessness as a factor of violence against women, it further addresses social stigma related to homelessness and to the homeless population in the United States. And while we do have laws to punish perpetrators of violence against women and laws to help victims get back on their feet and receive appropriate protections, we do still lack a lot in assisting more varieties of victims. Some implications for social work are, in terms of prevention, creating a policy brief about a bill like H.R. 1963 will hopefully contribute to passing it or a similar bill in the future. In terms of intervention, creating this policy brief seeks to support a bill which could amend current laws to be more inclusive, fair, and aware, thus intervening in the systemic discrimination against certain groups of victims. And in terms of policy, supporting this bill can directly contribute to its passing or the passing of a similar bill, at the very least highlighting citizen support for something that can make a real difference for so many people. Some reactions and what worked and what didn't. My friends and family really didn't think I would receive a response, and unfortunately, I did not receive a response. However, I learned in more detail what could be considered activism and what is considered activism and how I can actually be a part of that. And I loved the fact that I was able to create a policy brief and learn how to create one and do the research that goes into creating one, and that I was able to send it out to a senator. And even though I didn't get a response, I do feel like I made some kind of a difference, and I at least gained exposure to this kind of activism. Some reflections. Next time, I would send the policy brief and the letter to more people. I did feel that I was doing something important and it was interesting to do, and I enjoyed being able to learn more about this pressing social issue. And again, I learned how to create a policy brief and what goes into doing so. And even though I didn't receive a response, I am glad that I was able to do this, and I am happy with my activism choice. And these are just some of the resources for this project. It's not everything that I found, but it was what was relevant to this presentation. So thank you so much for listening, and I wish you all luck after we graduate.